The early morning sun was just beginning to peek through the large glass windows of Atlanta International Airport as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked through the bustling terminal. Her black shoes, polished to perfection, clicked softly against the airport's shiny floor. She moved with confidence, pulling her small pilot's suitcase behind her while fellow travelers rushed past, most of them too busy with their own journeys to notice her. At 42 years old, Sarah had earned every bit of respect that came with her position. Her pilot's uniform fit her perfectly, dark blue jacket pressed crisp and clean, gold stripes on the sleeves gleaming under the airport lights, and her captain's hat held carefully under her arm. Her natural hair was neatly styled in a professional bun, meeting all airline regulations while still embracing her identity. 15 years of flying experience showed in the way she carried herself. From the moment she had first dreamed of becoming a pilot at age 12, visiting an aviation museum with her school in Atlanta, Sarah had faced and overcome countless obstacles. Now, with more than 10,000 flight hours under her belt, she was one of the airline's most respected Boeing 787 commanders. This morning's flight to London was particularly special. Sarah had flown this route many times before, but today she would be mentoring a new first officer on their first transatlantic crossing. She smiled to herself, remembering her own first long-haul flight and how nervous she had been. Now, it felt as natural as driving to the grocery store. As she made her way to Gate B-23, Sarah noticed the usual mix of reactions from people around her. Some did a double take. A black woman in a pilot's uniform still surprised many people in 2024. Others smiled warmly, and a few parents pointed her out to their children. One little black girl, probably around 7 years old, stared at her with wide eyes full of wonder. Sarah gave her a friendly wave, remembering how much it would have meant to her younger self to see someone like her in this uniform. Checking her watch, a gift from her parents when she got her first pilot's license. Sarah saw she was 2 hours early for her flight. She always arrived early to double-check everything personally. Today, she wanted to review some weather patterns over the Atlantic and discuss the flight plan with ground crew before the pre-flight briefing. At the gate counter, Jessica, one of the regular gate agents, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Captain Mitchell. Another London flight today?" "Yes, indeed," Sarah replied, setting down her suitcase. "How are our passenger numbers looking?" "Full flight today, Captain. First class is completely booked, and we have a few VIPs on board." Jessica pulled up the manifest on her computer screen. Sarah nodded, reviewing the information. The weather report showed some turbulence over the Atlantic, nothing serious, but something she'd need to brief the passengers about. She decided to board early as a passenger first to check on a few cabin details before heading to the cockpit for her pre-flight duties. "I'll take my first-class seat for about 30 minutes before starting the pre-flight checks," Sarah told Jessica, who handed her a passenger boarding pass for seat 2A. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Fly safe, baby girl. Show them what excellence looks like." She smiled, typing back a quick "Always, Mom. Love you." As she waited for general boarding to begin, Sarah reviewed her mental checklist. She had done this countless times, but she never cut corners. Her father, a high school science teacher, had always taught her that excellence wasn't about being perfect. It was about being prepared and professional, especially when others might be looking for reasons to doubt you. Little did Sarah know that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary. As she stood there in her pristine uniform, flight plan in hand and confidence in her heart, she couldn't have guessed that in just a few minutes she would face a situation that would test not just her professionalism, but her dignity and grace under pressure. The boarding announcement began to echo through the terminal, and Sarah picked up her suitcase. It was time to board her own flight. First as a passenger checking the cabin, then as the commander who would guide this massive aircraft and hundreds of souls safely across the Atlantic Ocean. Sarah boarded the aircraft quietly, nodding politely to the flight attendants at the door. Most of the regular crew knew her, but today there were several new faces. Among them was Amy Wilson, a flight attendant who had just finished her training last week. This was only Amy's third flight, and she was eager to prove herself. As Sarah made her way to her first-class seat, 2A, she noticed the usual luxury of the cabin: the wide leather seats, the fresh flowers in small wool vases, and the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the galley. She placed her small suitcase in the overhead bin and settled into her seat, taking out her tablet to review some final flight details. The other first-class passengers began boarding, mostly businessmen in expensive suits and a few well-dressed women. Sarah noticed the subtle glances thrown her way, some curious, others disapproving. She was used to it. Being a black woman in spaces traditionally dominated by white men had taught her to develop a thick skin. Emmy Wilson approached Sarah's seat, her new name tag gleaming under the cabin lights. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said with a forced smile. "I believe there might be some confusion. Could I see your boarding pass?" Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and handed over her first-class ticket. She had experienced this before and knew exactly what was coming. Amy studied the ticket with a frown. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice carrying through the quiet cabin. "These are first-class seats." "Yes, I know," Sarah replied calmly. "That's my assigned seat." By now, other passengers were watching the scene unfold. A man in an expensive business suit 2 rows behind spoke up loud enough for everyone to hear. Perhaps she got upgraded by mistake. That happens sometimes when they overbook coach. Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. She had worked too hard and come too far to let this situation rattle her. Another passenger, a woman wearing designer clothes and too much jewelry, joined in. "I paid full price for first class," she announced to no one in particular. "They can't just let anyone sit here." Amy shifted uncomfortably, clearly encouraged by the passenger's comments. "Ma'am, I think it would be better if you moved to economy. I'm sure we can find you a nice seat there." Just then, Mark Stevens, the lead flight attendant, walked up to investigate the commotion. He was new to this route, but had been flying for 10 years. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Amy and Sarah. "This passenger claims to have a first-class ticket," Amy explained, emphasizing the word passenger in a way that made Sarah raise an eyebrow. "I think there's been a mistake." The businessman behind them spoke up again. "Some people need to know their place," he said, not even trying to lower his voice. Sarah noticed a young black girl in economy watching the scene through the curtain divider, her eyes wide and uncertain. That sight made something shift inside Sarah. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about that girl and every other person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin. Mark looked at Sarah's ticket and then at her, his expression showing the same doubt as Amy's. "Ma'am, perhaps we should sort this out in the galley." Several other passengers were now openly staring, some recording with their phones, others whispering among themselves. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah sat straighter in her seat, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She could feel her heart beating faster, not from fear or embarrassment, but from a familiar determination. The same determination that had carried her through flight school, through training, through every obstacle that had been placed in her path. She looked at her watch. In exactly 45 minutes, she was supposed to begin her pre-flight checks in the cockpit. But first, she would have to deal with this situation. Not with anger, not with indignation, but with the same professionalism and dignity that had earned her those captain's stripes on her shoulders. Little did Amy, Mark, or any of the judgmental passengers know, but they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The situation in first class was getting worse by the minute. More passengers had stopped their boarding to watch the scene unfold, creating a traffic jam in the aisle. The whispers had grown louder, and the phone cameras were still recording. Sarah remained seated, her back straight and her expression calm, though inside her mind was racing through years of similar experiences. She thought about her first day at flight school, when someone had asked if she was lost and looking for the flight attendant training program. She remembered the countless times she had been mistaken for support staff rather than the captain. "Ma'am," Mark, the lead flight attendant, said more firmly now, "I must insist we resolve this situation quickly. We have a schedule to maintain, and our first-class passengers need to be settled." A well-dressed older woman in row 3 snorted. "First-class passengers," she repeated with emphasis, giving Sarah a dismissive look. "Standards really aren't what they used to be." Amy, the new flight attendant, was now standing with her arms crossed, looking increasingly confident in her position. "I can escort you to economy right now," she offered in what she probably thought was a helpful tone. "There are still some middle seats available." Sarah glanced at her watch again. 30 minutes until she needed to start her pre-flight checks. She could feel a headache building behind her eyes, but years of training had taught her to stay focused under pressure. "I would like to speak to the captain about this," the businessman from earlier demanded loudly. "This is unacceptable. I pay extra for first class to avoid these kinds of disruptions." Mark looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Sir, I'm sure we can resolve this without bothering the captain. The flight crew is very busy with pre-flight preparations." Sarah almost smiled at the irony. Just then, a young white man in a pilot's uniform entered first class, heading toward the cockpit. He was Thomas Parker, the first officer who would be flying with Sarah today. He stopped, noticing the tense scene. "Is everything all right here?" Thomas asked, looking concerned. Amy quickly turned to him. "Oh, thank goodness. Sir, we have a situation with a passenger who's refusing to move from first class." Thomas looked at Sarah, confusion crossing his face. But before he could speak, another passenger chimed in. "This is ridiculous," a man in an expensive suit said. "I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Does anyone check tickets anymore?" The young black girl who had been watching from economy was now clutching her mother's hand, looking upset. Sarah caught her eye and gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Maybe we should call security," Amy suggested to Mark, loud enough for everyone to hear. The atmosphere in the cabin grew even tenser. Several passengers nodded in agreement with Amy's suggestion, while others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Thomas, the first officer, stepped forward, clearly recognizing Sarah but unsure how to handle the situation. She gave him a subtle shake of her head, silently asking him to wait. Mark pulled out his phone, presumably to call airport security. "Ma'am, this is your last chance to move voluntarily before we have to take more serious measures." Sarah could feel the weight of her pilot's license in her uniform pocket. She thought about all the young girls who dreamed of flying but never saw anyone who looked like them in the cockpit. She thought about her parents, who had taught her to handle discrimination with dignity and strength. The situation had reached its boiling point. Passengers were getting restless, the flight attendants were becoming more aggressive, and the clock was ticking toward departure time. Sarah took a deep breath. It was time to end this, but she would do it her way, with professionalism, grace, and a lesson none of these people would soon forget. She reached for her uniform jacket's pocket, ready to reveal something that would silence every voice in that cabin. The real captain of this flight was about to make herself known. The first-class cabin was thick with tension as Sarah slowly reached into her jacket pocket. Every eye was fixed on her movement, waiting to see what kind of excuse or argument she might try to make. "Before you call security," Sarah said calmly, her voice clear and professional, "I think I should show you something else besides my first-class ticket." She pulled out her pilot's license and captain's credentials, along with her airline ID badge showing her rank as captain. Without saying a word, she held them out to Mark, the lead flight attendant. The gold wings on her ID badge caught the cabin light, making them shine. Mark's face went pale as he read the credentials. Captain Sarah Mitchell?" he stammered, his eyes darting between the ID and Sarah's face. Amy, who had been standing confidently just moments ago, took a step backward. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The phone in her hand, which she had been ready to use to call security, slowly lowered to her side. "Yes," Sarah replied, standing up to her full height. Her captain's stripes gleamed on her sleeves. "I'm not just sitting in first class today. I'm commanding this flight to London." The silence that fell over the cabin was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Thomas, the first officer, stepped forward with a respectful nod. "Captain Mitchell, I've completed the external checks. We're ready for the pre-flight briefing whenever you are." The businessman who had been so vocal earlier suddenly became very interested in his shoes. The woman who had complained about standards sank lower in her seat, her face turning a deep shade of red. Sarah turned to face the entire cabin, her voice remaining professional but firm. "I understand assumptions can be made about people based on how they look. I've experienced it my entire career, but today I'll be responsible for flying this Boeing 787 safely across the Atlantic Ocean, along with my excellent first officer, Mr. Parker." She paused, letting her words sink in. The young black girl in economy was now beaming, her eyes shining with pride and amazement. "I've been a pilot for 15 years, Sarah continued. I've flown through storms, handled emergencies, and kept my passengers safe through thousands of flights. My appearance has nothing to do with my capabilities or my right to be in this seat, or in that cockpit." Amy's eyes were now filled with tears of embarrassment. "Captain, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have." Sarah raised her hand gently to stop her apology. "We all have learning moments, Ms. Wilson. What matters is what we do with them." The passengers who had been recording earlier had long since lowered their phones, most of them looking ashamed. A few were discreetly wiping their eyes. Mark stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly. "Captain Mitchell, please accept our deepest apologies. This should never have happened." Sarah checked her watch one final time. "I need to prepare for our flight now. I trust there won't be any further questions about my seating assignment." "No, ma'am. No, Captain," Amy whispered. As Sarah gathered her things to head to the cockpit, several passengers tried to catch her eye to offer apologetic looks. The businessman who had been so vocal stood up as if to say something, but seemed to think better of it and sat back down. Before leaving first class, Sarah paused by the curtain divider where the young black girl stood with her mother. She pulled her captain's wings pin from her jacket. "What's your name?" she asked the girl softly. "Maya," the girl replied, her eyes wide with wonder. Sarah pinned her wings to Maya's shirt. "Remember this day, Maya. The sky has room for all of us." As Sarah walked toward the cockpit, her head high and her steps confident, she heard Maya whisper to her mother, "Mom, I know what I want to be when I grow up." Sarah smiled to herself. Sometimes the best response to prejudice wasn't anger or argument, it was excellence. And in about 7 hours, she would land this plane safely in London, proving once again that capability had nothing to do with color and everything to do with competence. The atmosphere in the aircraft changed completely after Sarah's revelation. The same cabin that had been filled with judgment and whispers just minutes ago now buzzed with a different kind of energy, one of shame, admiration, and self-reflection. As Sarah walked toward the cockpit, several passengers who had watched the scene unfold began speaking in hushed, embarrassed tones. The businessman who had been so vocal earlier pulled out his phone, but this time not to record. Instead, he was quickly deleting the video he had taken, his face flushed with shame. Emmy Wilson, the new flight attendant, stood in the galley wiping tears from her eyes. Her hands shook as she tried to arrange the welcome drinks for first class. More than once, she had to stop to collect herself. The reality of what she had done, trying to remove her own captain from first class, was sinking in deeply. "I'm going to lose my job," Amy whispered to Mark, her voice trembling. "My first week as a flight attendant, and I discriminated against the captain." Mark, still looking shaken himself, put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Take a deep breath. Captain Mitchell handled it with incredible grace. We need to learn from this, not fall apart." In first class, the passengers who had been so quick to judge were now experiencing their own moments of discomfort. The well-dressed woman who had complained about standards sat stiffly in her seat, repeatedly adjusting her expensive scarf as if it was suddenly too tight. Meanwhile, in economy class, the story of what had happened was spreading quickly. Passengers whispered to each other, and several people were trying to peek through the curtain divider to catch a glimpse of the black female captain who had handled the situation with such dignity. Maya, the young girl who had received Sarah's captain wings, had become something of a celebrity in her section. Other passengers kept glancing at her pin, and a few parents brought their children over to look at it. "My daughter is going to be a pilot too," Maya's mother announced proudly to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying through the cabin, "and nobody's going to tell her where she can or can't sit." Back in first class, the passenger who had suggested calling security was now in an intense conversation with his seatmate. "I've never felt so small in my life," he admitted. "I've been flying for 30 years, and I just assumed." "We all did," his seatmate replied quietly. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Thomas, the first officer, returned from the cockpit to make an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Mitchell has asked me to inform you that we'll begin boarding the remaining passengers now. We expect an on-time departure." The simple professionalism of his announcement made several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The captain they had tried to remove was now responsible for their safety across the Atlantic. Amy gathered her courage and approached Thomas. "Sir, could you please tell Captain Mitchell?" she started, but her voice cracked. Thomas looked at her kindly. The captain suggested you join her in the cockpit for a moment before we finish boarding. She'd like to speak with you. Amy's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded and headed toward the cockpit. As she walked through first class, she couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The businessman who had been so vocal suddenly spoke up again, but his tone was completely different now. "Miss," he called to Amy, "please tell the captain, tell her I'm sorry too." One by one, other passengers began adding their apologies, their voices subdued and sincere. The same people who had been ready to have Sarah removed were now asking to convey their regret to her. As the remaining passengers boarded the plane, they entered a cabin transformed. The first-class section was quieter than usual, its occupants lost in thought. In economy, there was a sense of pride, especially around Maya's seat, where her captain's wings caught the light. And in the cockpit, Sarah sat in the captain's seat, reviewing her pre-flight checklist with the same precision and professionalism she had shown throughout the incident. She had turned a moment of prejudice into a powerful lesson, one that none of the passengers on Flight 2473 to London would ever forget. Amy stood nervously outside the cockpit door, her hand shaking as she pressed the entry buzzer. When the door opened, she found Captain Sarah Mitchell sitting in the left seat, calmly reviewing flight documents. "Come in, Ms. Wilson," Sarah said kindly, turning to face the young flight attendant. The captain's voice was warm, without a trace of anger. Amy stepped into the cockpit, her eyes red from crying. "Captain Mitchell, I don't even know how to begin apologizing." Sarah gestured to the jump seat. "Please, sit down. I think we should talk about what happened, but more importantly, about what happens next." Thomas, the first officer, quietly excused himself to give them privacy, closing the cockpit door behind him. "I was wrong, so wrong," Amy burst out, tears threatening again. "I made assumptions based on how you looked, and I'm ashamed of myself. I'll submit my resignation as soon as we land." Sarah smiled gently. "Is that what you think I want? For you to quit?" Amy looked up, confused. "You don't want me to resign?" "No," Sarah replied firmly. "I want you to learn from this moment and become a better flight attendant because of it. Running away won't solve anything." The captain reached into her flight bag and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a younger Sarah, dressed in a flight attendant's uniform. "This was me, 15 years ago," she explained. "I started as a flight attendant too, while I was working my way through flight school, and yes, I faced discrimination then, just like I do now. But every negative experience taught me something valuable about leadership." Amy stared at the photo, then back at Sarah, her eyes wide with surprise. The easiest thing would be to get angry, to demand punishment, to let bitterness take over, Sarah continued. But the harder path, the path of leadership, is to turn these moments into opportunities for change. Standing up, Sarah straightened her uniform and looked directly at Amy. "So here's what we're going to do. You're going to go back out there and provide excellent service to every passenger, including those in first class. You're going to remember this day every time you meet someone who doesn't fit your expectations. And you're going to share this story with other flight attendants in training." Amy wiped her eyes, sitting up straighter. "Yes, Captain, I promise I will." "Good," Sarah nodded. "Now, I need to make an announcement to the cabin before we take off. Would you like to help me turn this situation into a teaching moment for everyone?" A few minutes later, Sarah's voice came over the aircraft's speaker system. Her tone was professional and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mitchell speaking from the flight deck. In a few moments, we'll begin our journey to London. Today, before we take off, I want to share something important with you." The cabin fell silent, every passenger listening intently. "Aviation has taught me that the sky doesn't care about our gender, race, or assumptions. It cares about competence, preparation, and professionalism. Every person on this aircraft, our first officers, flight attendants, ground crew, and yes, your captain, has earned their place here." She paused for a moment before continuing. "Today, we had a reminder that appearances can trigger assumptions. But true leadership means turning challenging moments into opportunities for growth. As your captain, I'm not just responsible for flying this aircraft. I'm responsible for creating an environment of respect and understanding for everyone on board." The cabin remained quiet, but heads were nodding throughout first class and economy. So let's begin this flight fresh. Our wonderful cabin crew, led by Mr. Stevens and including Ms. Wilson, will take excellent care of you. My first officer, Mr. Parker, and I will ensure a safe and comfortable flight to London. Welcome aboard. As Sarah finished her announcement, spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin. Amy, standing near the cockpit door, noticed that the businessman who had been so vocal earlier was clapping the loudest. In economy, Maya proudly touched her captain's wings pin, sitting up taller in her seat. Her mother smiled, taking a photo of her daughter wearing the wings, a moment that would inspire not just Maya, but many others who would hear this story in the years to come. The flight to London progressed smoothly at 37,000 feet. As the aircraft cruised over the Atlantic Ocean, the impact of the morning's events continued to ripple through the cabin in unexpected ways. During the meal service, Amy noticed a complete change in the first-class passenger's behavior. The businessman who had been so confrontational earlier stopped her as she passed his seat. "Miss," he said quietly, "I have a daughter who's studying engineering. Would it be possible? Could you ask Captain Mitchell if she'd be willing to speak with her briefly when we land? My daughter faces similar prejudices in her field." Amy smiled, feeling a warmth replace her earlier shame. "I'll certainly ask the captain, sir." Throughout the cabin, passengers were engaging in thoughtful conversations. The well-dressed woman who had complained about standards was now showing Maya's mother pictures of her own granddaughter on her phone. "She wants to be a doctor," the woman explained, her earlier prejudice replaced by reflection. "People keep telling her to consider nursing instead. I think I understand now why that's wrong." In economy class, a school teacher traveling with her students had turned the morning's events into an impromptu lesson. The children were drawing pictures of airplanes, many of them now adding female pilots to their artwork. Maya had become their unofficial expert, proudly explaining what each of the captain's wing symbols meant. Halfway through the flight, Sarah handed control to Thomas and took her regulated break. As she walked through the cabin to stretch her legs, passengers who had earlier avoided eye contact now looked at her with respect and admiration. A young woman in business attire stopped her in the aisle. "Captain," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm an MBA student, the only woman in my class. What happened today, seeing how you handled it, it gave me strength." Sarah spent a moment with her, sharing words of encouragement before continuing her walk through the cabin. As she passed Maya's seat, she noticed the girl had fallen asleep clutching the captain's wings pin, a half-finished drawing of an airplane on her tray table. Back in the galley, Mark and Amy were discussing the events with other crew members during their break. "I've been flying for 10 years, Mark admitted, and I've never seen someone turn a negative situation into such a powerful teaching moment." Amy nodded, arranging drinks on her cart. "She could have had me fired. Instead, she taught me how to be better. I'll never forget this flight." Near the end of the flight, as they began their descent into London, Sarah's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Heathrow Airport. The weather is clear, and we expect a smooth landing." The familiar announcement carried new weight now. Passengers who normally ignored such messages listened intently to every word from their captain. As they broke through the clouds over London, the businessman who had requested the meeting for his daughter turned to his seatmate. "You know what the most remarkable thing is? She didn't just change how we think about female pilots or black pilots. She changed how we think about leadership itself." His seatmate nodded thoughtfully. "Grace under pressure. That's real power." The landing was indeed smooth, perfect even. As the aircraft touched down at Heathrow, spontaneous applause broke out, more enthusiastic than the usual smattering of claps that sometimes followed a landing. As passengers began to deplane, many lingered, hoping to thank the captain personally. Sarah stood at the cockpit door, professional as ever, accepting their words with grace. The last to leave was Maya and her mother. Sarah knelt down to the girl's level. "Keep drawing those airplanes," she said warmly. "And remember, the sky belongs to everyone." Emmy watched this final interaction from the galley, her earlier tears of shame replaced by determination. She would never again judge someone based on appearances, and she would make sure to share this story with every new flight attendant she met. As the crew prepared for their layover, it was clear that this flight had been more than just a journey from Atlanta to London. It had been a powerful lesson in prejudice, professionalism, and the quiet strength of leading by example. And somewhere over the Atlantic, assumptions have been transformed into understanding, one passenger at a time. 3 months after that memorable flight to London, Sarah Mitchell's story had taken on a life of its own. What started as an incident in first class had grown into something much bigger, touching lives far beyond that single aircraft. One morning, Sarah walked into the airline's main training center in Atlanta to give a special presentation. The room was packed with new flight attendants, including Amy Wilson, who now helped train others using her experience from that day. As Sarah entered, she noticed something different. The walls of the training center displayed new posters showing diverse pilots, men and women of all races. Among them was a photo of her standing in front of her Boeing 787, which had become a symbol of change within the airline. Captain Mitchell, Amy greeted her with a warm smile, no longer the nervous new flight attendant she had been. Would you believe we've made your story part of our standard training? Sarah looked at the eager faces of the trainees. Many of them already knew her story. It had spread through social media, aviation forums, and news outlets. But more importantly, it had sparked real changes in airline policies and training procedures. The airline had introduced new diversity and bias awareness programs, not just for cabin crew but for all staff. They called it the Mitchell Protocol, a set of guidelines for handling assumptions and prejudice in the aviation industry. During her presentation, Sarah shared something she hadn't told many people. Remember Maya, the young girl I gave my wings to? Well, she wrote me a letter last week. Sarah pulled out the letter, written in careful childish handwriting. Dear Captain Mitchell, I started taking flying lessons at my local flight school. They have a program for young people. At first, some people were surprised to see me there. But I told them about you, and now they just see me as a future pilot. The room fell silent as Sarah continued. Maya isn't alone. Since our story went public, flight schools across the country have reported an increase in applications from young women and minorities. The businessman from the flight had kept his word too. His daughter, the engineering student, had started a mentorship program at her university, inspired by Sarah's handling of discrimination. They called it Wings of Change, connecting young women in STEM fields with experienced mentors. Even the first-class incident had led to unexpected positive changes. The airline now used the security camera footage from that day, with faces blurred, as a training tool, showing how bias can appear in unexpected places, and how professional leadership can transform difficult situations. Amy stepped forward to share her part of the story. I almost quit that day, she told the trainees. But Captain Mitchell taught me that running away doesn't solve anything. Now, I share my mistake openly, helping others learn from it. Sarah looked around the room, seeing the impact of that single flight reflected in dozens of attentive faces. Leadership isn't about avoiding mistakes, she told them. It's about how we handle them when they happen and what we learn from them. After the presentation, a young black woman approached Sarah. Captain, I've been afraid to apply to flight school because I've never seen anyone who looks like me in the cockpit, but after hearing your story... Apply, Sarah said firmly. The sky needs all of us. That evening, as Sarah prepared for another flight, she received an email from the airline's CEO. They were launching a new scholarship program for aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. They wanted to name it after her. As she walked through the terminal in her captain's uniform, Sarah noticed something different. There were still double takes and surprised looks, but now they were often followed by smiles of recognition and respect. Parents pointed her out to their children, not as an oddity, but as an inspiration. Maya's captain's wings pin had started a trend too. Sarah now carried extra pins in her flight bag, giving them to young dreamers she met along her routes. Each pin carried the same message: the sky has room for everyone. The story of that flight to London hadn't ended with the landing. Instead, it had become a beginning of changed minds, new policies, and open doors. Sarah had shown that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't confrontation, but calm, unwavering excellence. And somewhere, in flight schools and classrooms across the country, a new generation of pilots was rising, their wings ready to soar.